242. Okay.
So, yes. Cool.
Thank you, Cindy. I was just about to ask that.
Oh, wait, can you not hear me?
Now we can.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. Cool. All right. I am prepared to go when anybody else is prepared.
We're good.
Is everyone ready?
Yep.
Okay, here we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. As we are all coming into the space, I am going to feature this week's embroidery of the week. I also have my trusty embroidery assistant here as well, Fig. So first things first, this week's embroidery of the week is a mule fat that was created by Lee Adams. And one of the reasons why I selected this one this week was it followed up to the Common Raven that we received a couple weeks ago, where it was an outline, and I just thought it was so delicate and so beautiful, and it had so much life. It felt like the mule fat was dancing. So this is the embroidery. And as we continue on, we'll do introductions. I'm Jen, and I'm calling in from Studio City, and I use she, her pronouns. And tonight, I will be continuing my underground embroidery, and I will pass it to Olan.
I'm just getting my bearings. I was just allowed in by Zoom. Yes, I am Olan. I'm in West Hollywood. I use she, her pronouns. I'm working on the Never-Ending Bird. And hey, I will pass it on to Marianne.
Thanks, Olan. Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne. I'm checking in from Silver Lake. It's my first time. I have my grandmother embroidered, and I have dish towels. And so when I read about the embroidery and the stories, that's what attracted me. So I don't have an embroidery project right now because it's my first time. But I'm really happy to be here with you all. And thank you. And I will pass it to Cynthia.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm calling in from West Covina, and I'm also working on the same bird that Olan's working on. And Marianne, I'll be happy to send you a kit if you send us your mailing address, if you email us.
Oh, thank you so much. The bird is really cool. Yeah, I'd love that. Okay, thank you.
And I will pass it on to Izzy.
Hello, sorry I'm backlit. My name's Izzy. I'm calling in from East Hollywood, and my pronouns are they, she. And today I'm working on this really awesome one. You can't really see it, but yay. Okay, I don't know who has gone yet. Has Jaime gone?
I haven't, no. I'm Jaime. I use he, him pronouns. I'm in East LA right now, and I will be sharing the screen with the book tonight for the reading. And I'll pass it on to Aaron.
Hello, I'm calling from Metabolic Studio in Los Angeles, California, and tonight I will be cleaning up the studio and driving home. I'm going to pass it on to Lauren.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm Lauren. I go with pronouns she, they. I'm calling from Metabolic Studio, and I'm working on one of these microscopic mycelium images, which has been very interesting. And glad to be with you tonight. And I would like to pass it on to Laura.
Hey, hi, I'm Laura, she, her pronouns, calling in from Kumeyaay territory. I'm so excited that you're all at Metabolic and then it's like live and you're there, like makes me really happy. And I'm gonna be muted and no video for a few more minutes and then I'll be joining you. So thank you, very excited to be here. Sorry, who am I passing it to? Who hasn't gone? Because I came in a little late.
I can go.
Great.
Hi, everybody. I'm James, he, him pronouns, calling from downtown Los Angeles. And tonight I will be reading the chapter and prompting some discussion questions with everybody. I will pass it to Rowena.
Hi everyone, I'm Rowena Koenig. I'm calling in from Tongva land in Mid-City. I'm working on the hermit thrush and yerba santa. I will pass it to Izzy.
I've already gone, but I can pass it to Ansu. Have you gone yet?
Hi there, I'm Ansu. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Los Angeles, Tongva land. And I'm just going to finish up my B, which is really looking like a B now, but I ran out of some dark thread, so I'm finding some dark thread for finishing that. And I'm looking forward to tonight's readings. So I am going to pass the ball to Kavi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kavi Lal, he, him pronouns. I'm on Miwok land in Sacramento, and I'm working on the hermit thrush. Still slowly making my progress here. Really looking forward to tonight's reading as well. I'll pass it over to Katz.
Hi. I'm in the Mojave Desert where the internet is not great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm she, her pronouns on Chemehuevi land outside Joshua Tree National Park, and I'm working on my avocado still. And Jen, have you gone?
I have, but I'll take it since you can't see probably maybe, and I will pass it to Maria. Oh, Maria, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Maria. I use she, her, and I'm in LA. Just came from a dance class, and I pulled out a few of my Metabolic Studio screened shirts from, well, now it's a couple of years, and I am going to start on this one and add embroidery. It says Bloom. Somebody else designed it, and I screened it years ago, and I really think this shirt would pop with some embroidery on it and maybe some beads. So that's what I'm doing. And I don't know who has not gone. Could you raise your hand if you haven't gone?
You know what? I think at this point everybody has gone, it looks like. So I'll take it over from here.
Okay.
The Metabolic Studios Learning and Mending series is now in its fourth evolution. This time around, we are addressing disturbance ecology and what emerges in the blasted landscapes of capitalism. To do this, we will be collectively reading Anna Tsing's The Mushroom at the End of the World on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. Growing through the last 3 gatherings, the first learning syllabus in response to ongoing racial violence, particularly at the hands of the police, the second holding space for the megafires that have consumed the West, and the third addressing the larger reality of suffocation and the need for us to revive our breath. In order to get a deeper understanding of these crises and how they are interconnected, we are building upon the readings in the last 3 series. Many of you have received embroidery kits from us of native plants representing the food and medicine that Metabolic Studio is cultivating. We are adding some new embroidery patterns. We also have more native plants and bird patterns available. The theme of the embroideries we've been working towards is biocenosis, which is an association of diverse organisms forming a closely integrated community. If you haven't received an embroidery kit, or you finished yours and would like another, please send your name and mailing address to info@metabolicstudio.org, and Cindy will put that information in the chat bar. We've decided to close the entrance to the Zoom space after the first 15 minutes of the reading to protect the flow and to keep a steady breath. These gatherings are being recorded through Zoom for archival purposes. We thank you for co-creating this opportunity to learn and to mend together during quarantine. Tonight, we'll read Interlude and Chapter 19 from The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing. This 10-week series will focus solely on this one book, and our guiding question is what lives in the ruins we've made. Since the ongoing pandemic began, we have moved our weekly public studio practice to Zoom, where we have committed ourselves to learning and mending together. We invite you to receive these readings as a deep inhale, and we find that crafting together helps to receive these readings as meditation. We will share our screen, and we encourage you to read a section of the text aloud with us. When there is a pause in the reading, please feel free to unmute yourself and begin where the last person left off. Silence is golden, and there is no pressure to fill the transitional spaces while we enjoy a breath and continue crafting. Feel free to jump in and continue reading at your comfort level. You don't have to read, it's also fine to enjoy listening. And now I will pass it over to James, where he will introduce us to tonight's discussions.
Thanks, Jen. And again, welcome everybody. I'll be sharing the discussion questions before the reading, and I'll share them again right before we go into breakout rooms after the reading. So the first discussion question is, what are your thoughts on Tsing's fugitive commons? Matsutake forests are by law privatized during picking season, but are open to the public the rest of the year. And the second question is, Tsing describes Matsutake as in between a state of alienation and entanglement. It flies freely in markets for capital, but requires the commons, traffic, and many other convergences that aren't straightforward. Is Matsutake alienated? Are other things, like more commodified crops and products, truly alienated if they are interdependent upon the larger phenomenon, like carbon cycling and global temperatures that we affect? And with that, Jaime, do you want to pull up tonight's reading? Elusive life, Kyoto Prefecture. Maintaining a forest in which Matsutake might thrive is a dance of clearing, raking, and staying alert to distinctive lifelines within the forest. Picking, too, is dancing. Oops, sorry. Interlude, dancing. Foragers have their own ways of knowing the Matsutake forest. They look for lines of mushrooms' lives. Being in the forest this way might be considered dance. Lines of life are pursued through senses, movements, and orientations. The dance is a form of forest knowledge, but not that codified in reports. And although every forager dances in this sense, Not all the dances are alike. Each dance is shaped by communal histories with their disparate aesthetics and orientations. To lead you into the dance, then, I step back into the Oregon forest. First, I go alone, then with a Japanese American elder, and then with two middle-aged men. To find a good mushroom, I need all my senses. For there is a secret to Matsutake mushroom picking. One rarely looks for mushrooms. Every now and then, one spots a whole mushroom, probably discarded by animals or so old that worms have consumed it. Good mushrooms, however, are under the ground. Sometimes I pick up the pungent aroma before I find any mushrooms. Then my other senses are alert. My eyes sweep the ground like windshield wipers, as one picker explained. Sometimes I get down onto the ground to look at a better angle or even to feel. I'm searching for the signs of the mushroom's growth, its activity line. Mushrooms move the ground slightly as they grow, and one must look for that movement. People call it a bump, but that implies a well-defined hillock, very rare. Instead, I think of sensing a heave, an effect like an inhalation of breath in the chest. The heave is easy to imagine as the breath of the mushroom. There may be a crack, as if the mushroom's breath escaped. Mushrooms do not breathe like that, and yet this recognition of common life forms the basis of the dance. There are lots of lumps and cracks in any forest floor, and most of them have nothing to do with the mushrooms. Many of them are old, static, and without indication of life's movement. The Matsutake picker searches for those that signal a living thing slowly pushing. One then feels the ground. The mushroom may be several inches below the surface, but a good picker knows, having sensed its liveliness, its lifeline. Searching has a rhythm, both impassioned and still. Pickers describe their eagerness to get into the forest as a fever. Sometimes, they say, they didn't plan to go, but the fever catches you. In the heat of the fever, one picks in the rain or snow, even at night with lights. One gets up before dawn to be there first, lest others find the mushrooms. Yet no one can find a mushroom by hurrying through the forest. Slow down, I was constantly advised. Inexperienced pickers miss most of the mushrooms by moving too fast, for only careful observation reveals those gentle heaves. Calm but fevered, impassioned but still, the picker's rhythm condenses this tension in a poised alertness. Pickers also study the forest. They can name host trees, but tree classification only opens the door, determining the area a picker might search. It is not so helpful in actually finding mushrooms. Pickers do not waste much time looking up into trees. Our gaze is directed below, where the mushrooms rise through the heaving earth. Some pickers mention that they pay attention to the dirt, favoring areas where the soil looks right. But when I press for specifications, they always demur. One picker was probably tired of my asking, and so he explained, the right kind of soil is the soil where Matsutake grows. So much for classification. Discourse has its limits here.
Rather than a class of soils, the picker scans for lines of life. It is not just the tree that is relevant, but the story that the area around it tells. Matsutake is unlikely to be found in fertile, well-watered places. Other fungi will grow there. If there are dwarf huckleberries, the ground is probably too wet. If heavy machinery has gone through it, this spells death for the fungus. If animals have left droppings and tracks, this is a place to look. If moisture has found a place to hide next to a rock or a log, this too is good. There is one little plant on the forest floor that all depends on Matsutake for far more than minerals. Candy cane forms a red and white striped stalk adorned by flowers but completely without chlorophyll that would allow it to make its own food. Instead, the plant drains sugars from Matsutake, which in turn takes them from the trees. Even after the flowers fade, candy cane's dry stalks can be seen in the forest, and they are indicator of Matsutake, whether fruiting or just a ball of fungal threads underground. Lifelines are entangled. Candy cane and Matsutake, Matsutake and its host trees and its herbs, mosses, insects, soil, bacteria, and forest animals, heavy bumps, and mushroom pickers. Matsutake pickers are alert to lifelines in the forest. Searching with all the senses creates this alertness. It is a form of forest knowledge and appreciation without the completeness of classification. Instead, searching brings us to the liveliness of beings experienced as subjects rather than objects.
Hiro is an elder in an urban Japanese American community. Now in his late 80s, he has led an exemplary working class life. When World War II broke out, Hiro was a young man living on a farm with his parents. His parents lost the farm when authorities moved them to a livestock yard and then into an internment camp. Hiro joined the US Army and served in the Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team, famous for the sacrifices it made to rescue whiter troops. Afterward, he worked in a forge making heavy equipment. For that long life of work, he receives $11 a year in pension. From this history of discrimination and loss, Hiro has helped to build an active Japanese American community. One component is Matsutake, a symbol of both fellowship and memory. For Hiro, giving away Matsutake is one of the greatest pleasures of picking. Last year, he gave Matsutake to 64 people, mainly older folks who couldn't get to the mountains to pick for themselves. Matsutake builds a sense of enjoyment through sharing. As such, too, it has become a gift that elders can give to the young. Before one even gets to the woods, then, Matsutake conjures memory. During the drive to the forest with Hiro, memory gets personal. He points out the window. That's Roy's Matsutake hunting place. Over there, it's Henry's special spot. Only later do I realize that both Roy and Henry are deceased. But they live on in Hiro's map of the forest, recalled every time he passes their spots. Hiro teaches younger people how to hunt for mushrooms, and with the skill comes the memory. As we walk into the forest, memory gets specific. Under that tree, I once found 19 mushrooms, a whole row, stretching halfway round the tree. Over there, I found the biggest mushroom I've ever found. 4 pounds it was, and still a bud. He shows me where storms have felled a once good mushroom tree. There will be no mushrooms there. We look at the places where a flood wiped off the topsoil and where pickers have undermined a bush by digging. Once those were good mushroom places, no more. Hiro walks with a cane, and it is amazing to me that he can still clamber over fallen logs, through brush, and up and down slippery ravines. But Hiro does not try to cover ground. Instead, he goes from one of his remembered mushroom spots to another. The best way to find Matsutake is to look where one has found it before.
Of course, if that spot is in the middle of nowhere, under a random bush near a random tree, it's pretty hard to remember that place from year to year. It would be impossible to catalog all the places one has found a mushroom. But Hero explains one doesn't have to. When one arrives in the spot, the memory washes over one, making every detail of that time come suddenly clear. The angle of a leaning tree, the smell of a resinous bush, the play of light, the texture of the soil. I have often experienced just that wash of memory. I am walking along what appears to be an unfamiliar stretch of forest, and suddenly the memory of finding a mushroom just there bathes my surroundings. Then I know exactly where to look, although finding it still is difficult, as you can imagine. This kind of memory requires motion and inspires an intimate historical knowledge of the forest. Hero remembers when a road was first opened to the public. There were so many mushrooms by the side of the road that you didn't have to go into the forest at all. He remembers particularly good years. I found 3 orange crates of mushrooms, and I couldn't figure out how to carry them to the car. All of this history is layered on the landscape, threaded in and out of the spots we check for new life emerging. The power of this dance of memory struck me particularly hard when we spoke of people who could no longer perform it. Hero brings mushrooms to those who can no longer walk in the forest. Gifting mushrooms reinserts the ill and the widowed into the communal landscape. Sometimes, however, memory fails, and then for better or worse, all the world becomes mushrooms. Hero's friend Henry told a poignant story of an elderly Nisei with Alzheimer's confined to a nursing home. When Henry visited, the old man told him, "You should have been here last week. That hillside was white with mushrooms." He pointed out the window to a clipped lawn where Matsutake would never grow. Without the dance of Matsutake forests, memory loses focus.
Hero takes me to a valley where commercial pickers were not so careful with the landscape. Hero is one of the most generous people I know, and he loves to work across racial and cultural categories. Yet after some hours, tired, he fell back into discouraged repetition. This was a good place before the Cambodians ruined it. This was a good place before the Cambodians ruined it. Cambodians is his shorthand for Southeast Asian pickers. And no American should be shocked by the clash of racial profiling through which we stereotype each other. Without wagging a finger at each Hero or the Cambodians, let me turn to the performance I learned from 2 Mian pickers. My point is not to show classificatory contrast, but to sweep you into another dance. For Moe Lin and Pham Soy, Matsutake picking is both a livelihood and a vacation. Every Matsutake season since the mid-1990s, they have made their way with their husbands from Redding, California, to the Central Cascades. On weekends, their children and grandchildren sometimes join them. When the season is over, Moe Lin's husband stacks crates at Walmart. Pham Soy's husband drives a school bus. In a good year, Matsutake picking is a better living than either of those alternatives. Still, they look forward to the season for multiple reasons, including the exercise and the fresh air. The women in particular feel released from the confinement of the cities. The neighborly shelters of their Mian encampment are the nearest they have come in the United States to a village in upland Laos. Mian mushroom camps are full of the bustle of village life. There are also reasons to forget, as Pham Soy reminds me when I ask about memories of home, because many Hmong pickers have told me that hiking the Oregon forest reminds them of Laos. I wonder about Mien. Yes, of course, she says, but if you just think about the mushroom, you can forget. Moe Lin and Pham Soy came to the United States with the tragedies of the US war in Indochina. After spending years in Thailand, they were accepted as refugees and moved to the mild weather and agriculture wealth of Central California. They had no English and no urban job experience. They grew their own foods and their husbands forged traditional tools. When they heard that money could be made picking mushrooms in the forest, they joined the autumn harvest. For them, pioneering new landscapes is an old skill. Once necessary to migrating, shifting cultivation, it is a useful skill for commercial mushroom picking, which, unlike heritage picking, requires covering a lot of ground. Unlike heritage pickers, for whom a half bucket of mushrooms is a good day's haul, commercial pickers know that a half bucket won't pay for gas. Commercial pickers can't afford to just check a few remembered spots. To make a living, they pick for longer days and in wider ranges and more diverse ecosystems. Unlike refugees from cities, Moe Lin and Pham Soy do not fear the forest and rarely get lost. Their group feels so comfortable that there is no need to stay close together. When I pick with them, the men go off on their own. Quicker trajectories, while the women forge their own way, returning to meet the men much later. Men run off chasing big bumps, explains Pham Soy, while women scratch the ground. I scratch the ground with Pham Soy and Moe Lin. Everywhere we pick, other pickers have been before us, but rather than cursing their messy digs, we explore them. Moe Lin leans over and touches her stick to the area where soil has been disturbed. No heave is in evidence because the surface has already been broken, but sometimes there is a mushroom. We follow the tracks of earlier harvesters, touching their remains, because Matsutake anchored to trees come up again in the same spots. This is a surprisingly productive strategy. We align ourselves with invisible pickers who have gone before us, but left us traces of their activity lines. Non-human pickers are at least as important as human in this strategy. Deer and elk love Matsutake, eating it in preference to other mushrooms. When we find the spoor of Dilker elk, it is often leads us to a patch. Bears turn over logs with Matsutake underneath and create quite a mess, digging up the ground. But bears, like deer and elk, never take all the mushrooms. To find a recent animal digging is a sure sign that mushrooms may be around, following the traces of animal lives. We entangle and align our movements, searching with them. Not all tracks guide one well. Often I find a lively bump, which pressed reveals just air, the tunnel of a gopher or a mole. But when I ask Moe Lin if she follows the guidance of candy cane, she frowns and says no. Other people will have already been there, she explains. It is too obvious a sign for the subtle entanglements we seek.
To view trash in this light is a big revelation for me. White hikers and the Forest Service hate trash. It mars the forest, they say. Southeast Asian pickers, they say, leave too much trash. Some have spoken of closing the forest to pickers because of trash. But out looking for lifelines, a little trash helps. Not the mountains of beer cans white hunters leave, but a little trash tracked through the forest. a wrinkled piece of tinfoil, the discarded vial of a ginseng tonic, a soggy box of Zhongnanhai super cheap Chinese cigarettes. Each of these is a sign that a Southeast Asian picker had passed through. I recognize the line. I align myself with it. It keeps me from getting lost. It puts me on the track for mushrooms. I find myself looking forward to the lines on which trash leads me. Trash is not the only Forest Service bugaboo. Another concern is raking, which means digging up the ground. Anti-raking spokesmen describe raking as the work of a single egotistical or ignorant men, Rakers dig the ground with their big sticks, heedless of the results for others. But women pickers show me something different. Sometimes the disturbed ground labeled as raking is the work of many hands. When many hands have touched an area to find its lifelines, a collectively produced trough can form. Raking is sometimes the result of many consecutive and entangled lifelines. The ground where Moi Lin and Pham Tsoi pick is not the sculpted moss and lichen carpet of Hero's Special Valley. In the volcanic high desert of the Eastern Cascades, the ground is dry. The trees are windblown, sickly, and sometimes sparse. Fallen trees litter the ground, their uprooted butts blocking passage. Waves of logging and Forest Service, quote, treatments have left a trail of stumps and roads and broken earth. It seems strange to argue that pickers are among the worst threats to the forest. Still, their tracks are here. For Moi Lin and Pham Tsoi, this is an advantage. By following lifelines and aligning their movements with them, Moi Lin and Pham Tsoi cover a lot of ground. We rise before dawn, and after a meal, we are in the forest at first light. We may be out in the forest for 4 or 5 hours before we contact the men on the walkie-talkie to find out where they've gone. And although the general contours of the hills are familiar, we're always checking new places. This is not the forest of familiar attachments. We scout new territory by following the lines of life.
At lunchtime, we sit on a log and pull out plastic bags of rice. Today our topping is carp, made into small brown nuggets, mixed with red and green bits. It's tantalizingly rich and spicy, and I ask how it's made. Pham Tsoi explains, you have a fish, you add salt. She falters, that's it. I imagine myself in the kitchen with a raw, salty fish dripping in my hand. Language has met its limit. The trick of cooking is in the bodily performance, which isn't easy to explain. The same is true for mushroom picking. More dance than classification. It is a dance that partners here with many dancing lives. The mushroom pickers I have described are observers of others, live performers, as well as performers of their own forest dances. They do not care about all the creatures of the forest. Indeed, they are quite selective. But the way they notice is to incorporate other life performances into their own. Intersecting lifelines guide the performance, creating one mode of forest knowledge.
Do you want to go to page 266?
May I ask, is there an order to the reading or people assigned prior? Is that how you know?
Yeah, we announced the reading list usually the week of
Thank you.
course.
But Marianne, we don't have an order to who reads. So basically we just take turns and then whoever wants to read jumps in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Discovering allies, Yunnan. An itinerant trader buying mushrooms at a rural market attracts a crowd. Wait, sorry, I got lost. Okay, sorry. I'll just read from the screen. Chapter 19, Ordinary Assets. Sometimes common entanglements emerge not from human plans, but despite them. It is not even the undoing of plans, but rather the unaccounted for in their doing that offers possibilities for elusive moments of living in common. This is the case for the making of private assets. Assembling assets, we ignore the common, even when it pervades the assembly. Yet, the unnoticed, too, can be a site for potential allies. Contemporary Yunnan is a place to consider this problem because, in the wake of the communist experiment, international and national elites are in a frenzy to make private assets everywhere. Yet, much asset making is strange and wrong. The juxtaposition between privatization and other ways people relate to things pops into view. Matsutake forests and the Matsutake trade are a case in point. Whose forests and whose trade? Forests, with their unbounded spaces and diverse ecologies, are everywhere a challenge for privatizers. For the past 60 years, Yunnan forests have ricocheted across multiple tenure arrangements, and the forest experts Michael Hathaway and I spoke with worried that peasants had become disheartened and confused in their management. Still, they were hopeful about one recent tenure category: the contracting of forests to individual peasant households. While not the free right of American private property, such contracts experts hoped might rationalize peasant landscapes. Powerful international overseers imagine individual tenure as a form of conservation because it offers incentives for wise use. In Yunnan, it also opens populist hopes. After an intense history of top-down impositions, here at last is a chance for local farmers to have some say in managing their own forests. Yunnan researchers, in dialogue with cosmopolitan developments in the field of political ecology, show how social justice goals may be possible through local control of forests made possible by household contracts. Thus, too, researchers are alert to the creativity and insights of farmers who learn how to use the privileges of contracts to solve local problems. One researcher reports on the ways villagers reallocate forest tracts to equalize the potential gains from each. She documents the work of adult brothers, for example, who switch forest plots sequentially to make sure each has a chance for benefits. But what are these imagined benefits? Yunnan has been under a logging ban for some years, and at least officially, timber is to be harvested only with permission and for domestic use. Yet there are other potential assets. In the mountains of the Zhejiang prefecture in central Yunnan, Matsutake is the most valuable forest product. Experts are excited about household contracts because of it. Without this step towards privatization, they say, the pickers might destroy the resource. Foresters told us of the horrors of other Yunnan areas where village pickers spread out before dawn, combing the commons with flashlights. This is chaos, they said. Besides, small mushrooms are picked before they achieved their highest market value. Contracts, in contrast, order the forest, blocking such wildness and inefficiency. Shujiang forests offer a model for making private assets, an example for forest reform for Yunnan and for all China. One widely praised arrangement for Matsutake management is the village auction. What is auctioned is access to villagers' contracted forests during the Matsutake season. The system is reminiscent of Japan's Irarai forest auctions. The right to harvest and sell Matsutake on villagers' lands goes to the auction winner. In the area we visited in Yunnan, the money gained from the auction is distributed to each household and forms an important part of its cash income. Without the press of competition from other pickers, the auction winner should be able to pick each mushroom when its market price is highest, thus maximizing his or her income as well as that of the compensated villagers. Advocates of household contracts also argue that the resource, Matsutake, will grow better without the pressures of chaotic overharvesting. But can Matsutake thrive in private forests? Let me approach this question in steps. Within the rural economy, auction winners are exemplary figures of the search to gather private assets. Boss L is one. He has won the contract to harvest Matsutake in his home village of 11 households, and he has also become a major local buyer. His relationships with government foresters and researchers are good. About 15 years ago, the foresters asked him to create a Matsutake showcased forest. He fenced off several hectares of forest and built a boardwalk meandering through so that visiting foresters and researchers could look at the model forest without disturbing it. Without peasant disturbance, the trees in the showcased forest have grown big and beautiful. The ground, undisturbed by peasant rakes, has built up a thick duff, that is, layers of leaves and needles over ever richer humus. It is refreshing to walk through this forest with its gracefully arching trees and its rich earth smells. When one spots a mushroom, it's a thrill. And since no one picks the Matsutake here, they rise out of the duff into neat umbrellas. Visitors come from many places to admire this Matsutake forest, but the foresters know enough to worry. There's too much duff. The humus is too rich. The Matsutake are still coming, but perhaps not for long. Matsutake prefer more goings on.
Certainly, there is plenty going on elsewhere. Outside the showcase forest, Matsutake forests are much used and abused. Everywhere Michael Hathaway and I went, broadleaf trees showed signs of extensive pruning for firewood. Many were reduced to a much hacked bushes. Pines too are cut as peasants remove branches to collect pollen or pine nuts, depending on species. Pine needles are raked for bedding for the pigs, which later become fertilizer for the fields. Goats are ubiquitous, eating everything, including young pines, which seem to have developed a, quote, grass stage, like adaptation to survive the heavy grazing. People are everywhere too, collecting medicinal plants, pig food, and commercially saleable mushrooms, not only Matsutake, but many kinds, from acrid Lactarius that must be dried or boiled to questionably edible Amanita. Far from serene and graceful, the forest is a busy intersection of traffic, both for human needs and for the benefit of their plant and animal domesticates. Yet these forests are the much praised model of individual access and closure. How can they also be the sites of so much traffic? I was confused by the dissonance between traffic and enclosure until I spent the day with Little L, another Matsutake forest auction winner, but one who works smaller forest holdings than Boss L. He took our team to his forest and introduced us to its plants and mushrooms. Like the other Matsutake forests I had seen in the area, it was a badly scarred young forest marked with traces of grazing and cutting. Little L did not mind. He showed us the richness of the forest's mushroom harvest emerging in the midst of all that traffic. And he explained the interplay between traffic and enclosure, clearing up my confusion. During the Matsutake season, he paints blazes where his forest borders on roads and trails. People know they should not enter, and in general, they do not, although there are some problems with poaching. The rest of the year, they are free to come, to gather firewood, to graze their goats, and to look for other forest products. Of course, despite his pride at Matsutake enclosure, Little L did not see this as subterfuge. How else would people get their firewood, he explained, if they could not enter the forests? This is not an official plan. Provincial foresters and experts do not talk about seasonal enclosure. If they know about it, they put it out of their minds as something international authorities would surely censure. Seasonal enclosures would defeat the program of the privatizationist conservation creed, because local residents are using resources in common just the way those experts frown upon. Besides, those experts would hate the way this forest looks, young, scarred, full of traffic. This is not the plan, and yet, might not this way of enacting privatization be the saving grace for Matsutake? The traffic keeps the forests open and thus welcoming to pine, and it keeps the humus thin and the soils poor, thus allowing Matsutake to do its good work of enriching trees. In this area, Matsutake pairs with oaks and oak relatives as well as pine. The whole young and scarred forest works with Matsutake to survive on mineral soils. Without all the traffic, the duff builds up. The soil becomes rich and other fungi and bacteria crowd out Matsutake. It is the traffic then that privileges Matsutake, making this one of the great areas of Matsutake production. Yet the traffic must take place under the radar of contracts, which were introduced to this area with the explicit purpose of saving Matsutake. Matsutake thrives in this fugitive commons. It is only Matsutake incomes that can be raised through individual access.
A detour through the issue of Matsutake incomes can help me generalize the point that private assets must always grow out of acknowledged commons. I'm going to repeat that sentence so I can understand it. A detour through the issue of Matsutake incomes can help me generalize the point that private assets most always grow out of unacknowledged commons. This point is not just about wily Yunnan peasants. Privatization is never complete. It needs shared space to create any value. That is the secret of property's continuing theft, but also its vulnerability. Consider again Matsutake as a commodity, ready to be sent from Hunan to Japan. What we have is mushrooms, that is, fruiting bodies of underground fungi. The fungi require the traffic of the commons to flourish. No mushrooms emerge without forest disturbance. The privately owned mushroom is an offshoot from a communally living underground body, a body forged through the possibilities of latent commons, humans and non-human. That it is possible to cordon off the mushroom as an asset without taking its underground commons into account is both the ordinary way with privatization and a quite extraordinary outrage when you stop to think about it. The contrast between private mushrooms and fungi forming forest traffic might be an emblem for commoditization more generally. the continual, never finished cutting off of entanglement. This brings me back to my earlier concern with alienation as an attribute of non-humans as well as humans. To become a fully private asset, Matsutake mushrooms must be torn not only from their life worlds, but also from the relations involved in their procurement. Picking the mushroom and transporting it outside the forest could take care of the first of these, but in central Yunnan, as in Oregon, the second rupture takes longer. In the small town where Michael Hathaway and I based our rural Yunnan research, 3 men were recognized as the key Matsutake bosses. Laoban, that is, the merchants who bought most of the area's Matsutake and sold it in the bigger towns. There were also mushroom buyers who came to the town's periodic markets, but they managed to buy only a small fraction of the Matsutake. As the bosses explained, visiting buyers did not have enough local ties. In watching the work of the bosses and their agents, I was struck particularly by the lack of negotiation over prices and grades, which I had come to expect from my fieldwork in Oregon. One boss sent his driver into the mountains to buy Matsutake from villagers there. The pickers handed over the mushrooms without a word, receiving a bundle of cash wordlessly in exchange. In other transactions, there was talk, but the pickers never asked the price offered for the mushroom, instead just taking whatever they were given. I watched one of the bosses receive a box of mushrooms delivered by a bus driver passing by. The boss explained that he would pay the picker later. I also saw pickers work through their own mushrooms, discarding those with insect damage rather than trying to pass what the buyer did not notice. All this seemed utterly exotic given my experience in Oregon, where competitive market negotiation took center stage from the moment pickers entered buyer space. This was also quite different from what happened just downstream on the Yunnan commodity chain. In dedicated mushroom markets in bigger towns and cities, price and grade negotiations were constant and intense. Many wholesale buyers competed against each other, and the scramble to determine the best prices and the most appropriate grade selection took up everyone's attention. Upstream, in contrast, the buying was quiet. Everyone we spoke with in the rural margin explained that buying without haggling occurs because of long-term relationships and the trust that goes with them. The bosses would give the pickers their best price, people said. There are community, family, and ethnic and linguistic ties between the bosses and the pickers. They are local guys, part of the small town scene. Pickers trust them. This trust is not a quality that works for everyone's equal advantage. I do not believe anyone confused trust with consensus or equality. Everyone knew that the bosses were getting rich off of Matsutake. Everyone wanted to emulate their success in gaining personal wealth. Still, it is a form of entanglement with reciprocal obligations. As long as the Matsutake are embedded in it, they are not fully alienated commodities. The exchange of Matsutake in the small town requires the recognition of appropriate social roles. It is only in the mushroom markets of the larger towns that the mushrooms break free, becoming fully alienated creatures of exchange.
In the relation between small town bosses and pickers, we see again how private assets depend on common living spaces. The bosses are able to buy local mushrooms on their own terms because they are entangled with the pickers. They can then transport the mushrooms to bigger towns where they can be converted into private wealth. It is in this light, too, that the project of issuing forest contracts can be understood as a project for redirecting wealth rather than saving forests. In household forest contracts, contractors can extract the value of the mushrooms, which in turn is drawn from an unacknowledged and fugitive commons. How wealth gets redirected is, however, still somewhat up for grabs. Here, the work of socially conscious Yunnan researchers is pressing. Their job is to turn promising local practices for keeping the wealth in villages and small towns into models for society and conservation. The conservation part of the equation is the trickiest part, however, because the lust for private wealth only occasionally benefits the forest. Often, instead, it sponsors unexpected destruction. One auction winner proudly showed me how he had learned to milk more wealth out of the Matsutake forests he had won the right to harvest. He had his men dig up rare species of flowering trees from the village forest covered under his Matsutake contract. The fact that these were rare and little-known species, he said, made them even more valuable. Since the city managers of Kunming, Yunnan's capital, demanded that mature trees suddenly grace what had been treeless streets, he and other entrepreneurs shipped full-grown trees into the city. Most of the trees died from the shock of removal and transport, but those that lived long enough to garner payment fetched a tidy profit. As for the forest, at the very least, it lost its diversity and the beauty of its flowering trees.
Such entrepreneurial stunts are part of the scramble for wealth in today's China. In them, we can see something about the remaking of humans in conjunction with the salvaging and savaging of landscapes. Matsutake bosses are much admired figures in Yunnan's countryside. Bosses are pioneers in the new search for private assets. So many I spoke with wanted to be bosses. If not for Matsutake, for some other product extracted from the countryside. One Matsutake boss had a plaque in his living room, awarded by the local government, proclaiming him a leader in making money. Rural bosses are replacements for socialist heroes. They are models for human aspirations. Bosses are embodiments of the entrepreneurial spirit. In contrast to earlier socialist dreams, they are supposed to make themselves, not their communities, wealthy. They dream of themselves as self-made men, yet their autonomous selves bear comparison to Matsutake mushrooms, the visible fruit of unrecognized, elusive, and ephemeral commons. Bosses privatize the wealth of collaboratively produced mushroom growth and collection. Such privatization of common wealth might characterize all entrepreneurs. The Yunnan countryside at this historical moment is good to think with because interest in rationalizing natural resource management extends only to property law and accounting. Privatization takes place merely by claiming the fruits of scavenging, not by reorganizing labor or landscape. I'm not trying to argue that such rationalization would be better. Certainly, it would not help Matsutake. However, there is something peculiar and frightening in this dedication to salvage, as if everyone were taking advantage of the end of the world to gather up riches before the last bits are destroyed. It is in this feature too that rural Yunnan is neither particular nor parochial. It is hard not to see all our enterprises in this same apocalyptic light. In rural Yunnan bosses, we see close focus models for how to salvage fortunes from the ruin.
Most commentators on China's new wealth, both Chinese and otherwise, write about millionaires in the cities, but the scramble for private assets is equally intense in the countryside. Farmers, landless migrants, small town bosses, and fancy companies all participate in an everything must go sale. It is hard to know how to think about conservation in such a social climate. However we begin, I don't think we can afford to forget the connection between value and latent commons. There are no Matsutake mushrooms without such evanescent mutualities. There are no assets at all without them. Even as entrepreneurs concentrate their private wealth through building alienation into commodities, they continue to draw from unrecognized entanglements. The thrill of private ownership is a fruit of an underground common. Well, thanks everybody for reading and listening. And before we go into our breakout groups, I will just read the discussion questions once more. Sorry, I gotta copy them. What are your thoughts on Singh's fugitive commons? Matsutake forests are by law privatized during picking season, but are open to the public the rest of the year. The second question is, Singh describes Matsutake as in between state of alienation and entanglement. It flies freely in markets for capital, but requires the commons, traffic, and many other convergences that aren't straightforward. Is Matsutake alienated? Are other things, like more commodified crops and products, truly alienated if they are interdependent upon larger phenomena, like carbon cycling and global temperatures that we affect? And with that, Jen, do you want to send us to our breakout rooms?
Yes, I will do that. We'll go to the breakout rooms for about 8 minutes, and then we'll come back as a group and discuss what we discussed in our breakout rooms. So I will send you those invites now. Rowena, okay, just
Thank you, Jaime.
We're supposed to stay in our room. We've been sent to our room and we cannot leave our room.
Yeah, it feels like that, right?
Because it said leave room and then
We're back.
couldn't-
It's
We're
just a
back.
Groundhog Day.
Yeah, you're back until you find something really good to say. And
Right,
that's
exactly.
it must be inspirational and have a working plan attached.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We were in the middle of our discussion when we got pulled out, so hopefully that didn't happen to anybody else. But if so, no worries. We can continue on here. Would anyone like to start with what they talked about in their room?
I'm happy to share a little bit of what we talked about in our group. So Ansu brought up a really good question about what is meant by the word alienation in this instance, and how maybe Singh is in conversation with Marxist notions of alienation, but is also kind of maybe doing something differently. And yeah, I'm not sure. I'm curious if anyone else picked up on that word and was thinking about that. I don't want to share what Ansu said, but I don't want to misrepresent what you'd said. If you want to jump in.
I mean, I just to answer very quickly, yeah, I think there is like that's in dialogue with that, the Marxist definition of alienation, but I do also think that like it pushes the boundary of it, right? Because that's very human, in the sense that you're alienated from your work under that theory, versus this is like maybe recognizing a different type of alienation. Like it would be, I wouldn't say it would be weird to call like what Matsutake does and all of the things around it labor. That's not to say it's like not hard work, but also labor is like such a very entwined human concept to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, labor, I mean, in a Marxist framework, labor only exists under capitalism in the sense that it's alienated.
Yeah, and to that point, Izzy, I think that there's such a contrast between the traditional model of gathering that is highlighted in the memories of Hero, where the mushroom picking, rather than being a hard and competitive labor, is sort of a joyful tribute to friends that are remembered, and then the fruits of that work are shared as gifts, versus the really empty and emotionally devoid interactions of the capitalist system described at the end, where workers are in competition with one another. The forest is just being gutted, and it's viewed as a scramble to extract the final resources from a failing system. And she uses the word apocalyptic to describe the situation, which seems so fitting. And the contrast between those two ways of relating to mushroom harvesting was just very emotional and stark, I thought.
And I think that this question of alienation kind of complicates the whole book, because up until now, we've been talking about Matsutake as these like radical life forms that blossom in scenes of disturbance and hide and are spontaneous and sporadic, etc. And now, and we've also talked about how they're picked and how they're part of this capitalist system. But I think bringing the word alienation into the conversation, it's at least made me rethink how like Matsutake picking when it's outside of the traditional, maybe heritage sense, but then folded into this system of capital that's really about exchange and amassing value, it kind of disillusions the whole thing for me a little bit, where I'm like, okay, so now how do we talk about it again? Also, my computer is going to die, so I have to go get my charger.
The comparison that Singh made between the Chinese urban market system, where you know, you're lauded if you've created wealth or you have a way of creating wealth, and that has been sort of directly translated or transposed into the countryside with these Matsutake bosses. I think that's where she's really playing on the critique of the capitalist system. And previously it was the socialist hero creating sort of wealth for the community, but they've just replaced that hero with the creating of the private wealth. And I think that's a problem that spans the entire globe, as we have all been just seduced into this system of value. And she had some really beautiful words in there about how we think of value versus the real work of creating that value, which is which goes unacknowledged, which is never articulate, which is hidden, and it's the commons. So I really enjoyed her ability to draw that out in the Matsutake example and to throw that into relief, because it's happening not only in Matsutake, but in every single element of our lives.
Yeah, I really liked kind of, it feels like, at least for me, like she's starting to pull on a thread of this woven illusion that we have put together in this world, which again, with entanglement, there's some symbolism there, but starting with Matsutake and seeing that, again, these unacknowledged, invisible, underground, fugitive commons that have to happen for Matsutake to exist and to be made into capital secondarily. And that kind of like pulling at that thread sort of begins to unweave the whole thing. You know, you start to think about, well, yeah, this is produced because of all these convergences, and this is like a very, not very neat because it's very entangled, but this is like a somewhat manageable scope of study that you can see how this works. But if you go larger and you start pulling at the threads, like, you know, if you look at crops, or if you look at animals, or any other thing that we rely on for market value and production, but also even just like breathing and living, those things are, you know, we try to alienate them, but they are also deeply, deeply entangled. But it's the scope is so large that it's maybe like a cognitive dissonance or a story we tell ourselves about how reality is made and extracted and divided.
Yeah, I think the whole idea that the commons are supporting so many aspects of our interconnected existence, whether it's forests, or as you're saying, you know, the systems that are literally supporting our ability to breathe and exist on this planet, challenges the idea of private ownership if the source of real value is the commons, is something that is rather arbitrarily controlled when it exists in such an entangled and interconnected way.
And I think, Rowena, just to build on that point and to link it to your question, James, about what do we think about the forest being closed for part of the year where Matsutake is harvested and open to the public, all the rest. It's clearly clearly problematic on the level of the commons. It favors capitalist extraction of a product in a space that's held in trust for the web of life and for anybody. So I think there's a lot to digest there too.
Especially since researchers and economists see that privatization as a means of conservation. That's how they pitch it, tying conservation and economy together. But yeah, sorry, go ahead, Ansu.
Good point. Yeah, and she showed how incredibly really misguided that thought is. Anyways, the concept of encircling a space to privatize it just to pick those fruits speaks exactly to how capitalism operates, Lauren. It's about scarcity. It's about saying this is a limited commodity and that's how you get value out of it.
And I think, you know, we read about Federici's idea of you know, the medieval enclosure being the beginning of the capitalist hegemony around resources. And I think that's so fascinating that that all of that links to a way of thinking about the world that goes back, at least she traces us back to the European Middle Ages. It's easy to get fully niched into the story of the Matsutake, and I think she quite expertly, through the use of language again, brings us into the broader context of the narrative, which is capitalism itself. And I thought your question was really terrific, James, about what do we think about that? Because thinking about that at all is not that common.
But yeah, it's a hegemonic system of thinking. Like, to pierce that, you need to have this creative use of language.
And I think that that's what the beauty in talking about Matsutake and thinking with Matsutake as a protagonist is, in the very like basic sense that Matsutake will always evade enclosure. The enclosure of capital, or the enclosure by the hand of capital, is one that is constructed, and Matsutake have spores that fly, and they can fly over metal gates, they can go underground, and that's where Matsutake are a guide to us, because it can show us the ways in which we can evade capital and move through its enclosures, perhaps. But then that gets kind of poetic, and then it's interesting to think about, like, okay, how can we actually apply that kind of rhizomatic underground movement to our daily life, innovating capital or undermining it?
I like that a lot, and adding to that, the idea as well that the Matsutake are unpredictable, that you can't farm them or return to the same spot every year, that there's something sort of serendipitous about encountering one.
This is really reliant on, capitalism is really reliant on a non-egalitarianism, whereas the system that Hiro was using to gather Matsutake is a completely different mindset. It's a mindset of sharing and communalism. And it's the exact opposite of this sort of hierarchy, the boss, the ones who don't get the price of the middle managers who sell in bulk. It's just this hierarchy that's implied as well. But I wanted to ask a question about as the opposite of the alienated value of the Matsutake, then you've got this, quote, fugitive commons. And Did anyone pick up on that word and why, how is that symbolic?
Well, I understand it as obviously it's fugitive in the sense that these are supposed to be privatized lands to peasant households for protecting and preventing the chaotic harvesting of picking, but they open them up and they open up these private lands, and that's the fugitive aspect of it. But I also I think I like the symbolism of it being a fugitive, again, just kind of tying into the idea of what lives in the ruins, which is that it's this idea that commons like Matsutanke do have a resiliency in some sense, in some cases that can be very inspiring, that no matter how hard you try to divide the forest or land, obviously it's successful in certain places. People do get away with really destroying that, but in this case, it's kind of a form of resiliency and resistance. That's the symbolism that I find from it.
I've been one thing running through my mind is this, idea that capitalism only works if people share, and another is entanglement, somewhat as interdependence. That's where I just find I was really captivated by the mushrooms and the way they are detected, the way they are found, the way they move, the way they grow, and this desire to capitalize on a natural, beautiful phenomenon of bountiful nature, in a sense, it sounds like, even because I missed the part about the mushrooms being the first to come back after the bombs. So even, indestructible nature, right? Interesting.
Yeah, that makes me, I was kind of struck by the section that mentioned how capitalism depends on sharing, and what kind of sharing then that entails. A sharing that I think is really different than the entanglement of life, and in the sense that maybe the connectivity within the capitalist system is one that is very intentional in what it consumes and what it embeds itself into.
Like networking, you mean?
Yeah, the development of
community.
Exactly. It's like a self-determined
transactional relationship instead of community generosity.
Yeah, it's a very it absorbs something into itself and then produces it to accelerate itself more. It's like almost more of an autopoietic system, an internal system. Whereas the system of not even system of entanglement, just the nature of entangled life is one that is more, has pulsations and isn't necessarily, it has intentionality, I think, but it's also much more spontaneous and complicated and murky, which Singh talks about, the murkiness and the contamination and how it's messy and weird, and it's not so programmed single tracked. It stretches out and across.
I like that, out and across.
Struck me is that this capitalist system is so powerfully reinforced by the system of science, because the entire forestry community, the entire forestry enterprise internationally is tied into the system that would ignore the incredible value of a forest that is lightly used by people, in which the biotic life underneath the soil, microbiology has incredible role to play. All of that is diminished. All of that is negated and almost erased in the scheme that the foresters are perpetuating and are proclaiming is the way to manage the resource. The only thing that the scientific community has recognized there is the fruit of that intricate system. And so capitalism has, so the notion of like a scientific examination or a scientific approach, as if that were supportive of life, to me, I question that, because it's a handmaiden of capitalism. It's a it's a tool of capitalism. It reproduces capitalist structures, and that's what's kind of disturbing about this. And it's an amazing piece of work then that Anat Singh has done to make that, to reveal that.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that aspect of, I think we talked about this before, is that, you know, most laboratories need funding, and who are the funders? They're not, you know, usually generous. Rarely are they generous people who love a forest and want to see something that they personally like not destroyed, but rather kind of walk the line between, well, like, how much of this can I get away with extracting without making it go completely away? And so there's that, you know, it's a fundamental problem, I would say, in the endeavor. And, you know, even in things like regenerative agriculture, and, you know, there are a lot of scientists who struggle with this because they are at the behest of making money, having a living, running a laboratory, successful careers, all that kind of stuff, but still want to do good, but are stuck within that system. So even in something like regenerative agriculture or sustainability, you have to pitch things as, you know, like, oh, like, use regenerative agriculture, like you'll double your crops and you'll use less pesticides and have these expenses, even though they themselves are, you know, perhaps at heart more interested in the actual regenerative work of the earth, have to pitch themselves in still within that framework, because those things aren't valued, even though they have tremendous value, because if we lose them, we lose ourselves.
That's right, because even the forest is viewed in terms of, quote, forest products, and the funding stream can come from agencies and enterprises that are very vested in, quote, the value of the forest products. So it's deeply corrupt. Science is a deeply corrupt enterprise, as much as I think there are scientists individually who, if you remove them from their lab and talk to them on a personal level, would see the ironies of it.
Totally. I mean, it's the same thing as somebody who is against extractive industry, but you buy gas for your car because you've got to get from A to B, or you've buy this from the grocery mart that involves that. It's that there's like no ethical consumption, and there's in a way no ethical research, but in the weird way, the research is kind of a consumptive effort as well, which is the system that we're charging, not the individual per se, if that makes sense.
And just to speak really quickly to the relationship between capitalism and science, and the way in which the Singh is kind of undermining that in this book by making science accessible and kind of available to those who, like me, don't have a scientific background but just want to learn. I mean, that's something that is really important, and I feel like it's just not done enough. Yeah, I really appreciate that aspect of her writing, and how she's also, you know, an anthropologist by trade, and so it feels accessible because she's learning with us in many ways, and she shares the conversations of learning that she has with scientists and pickers and people with, you know, traditional knowledge. She's sharing that with us as well. So the text feels radical in that sense.
It does feel radical, because I don't think that the people whose livelihood is, quote, science, would be paid to develop a language about science that's accessible to the rest of us, and that pierces that paradigm of the very capitalist roots of science. So yeah, radical is the right word about this text. But is there, I mean, is there another way of managing the forest given the scale of the human population? Can we, you know, can we go back to this more heritage model of using forests?
That's a big question. I think a lot of people are wondering.
As soon as she tells the story, though, the story itself has power of suggestion. You know, the story itself has imaginative power. And if we can even sort of touch individuals with imagination and education and sort of all these issues that she's bringing out, I think that's a wonderful, it's a wonderful thing. This is the kind of literature that the kind of humanities literature that we need for this age. About a different kind of relationship with the forest and with Matsutake and birds and bees.
Well, wait for,
Go ahead.
it sounds like, Ansu, you're almost talking about using, looking at the forest as a place to be curated and explained to an audience, because the people that, people go to the forest for different reasons, and most people don't spend a large amount of time in forests. So they'd have to learn about, you know, what they're looking at and what the cues are and what, how to track, as Jaime said earlier, who's been there and what's left behind. if you see what I'm saying.
I mean, I do, because most people couldn't tell you the name of the tree that's on the pavement in front of their house, much less understand a forest, because our education system, our whole training, our cultural bias has been against nature and in favor of value that's production. So everything we learn in our schools is, computers and banking and all of this other stuff, and engineering and mechanics, and not the incredible in plain sight, story of life that we need to survive.
Well, there is certainly a lot that educators are responsible for, and there are curricula, and there are exam standards to meet, and educational goals that they have. I don't know that I'd be so down on. It's hard to be down on cast blame or say any one particular aspect of our civilization causes it. And I don't particularly subscribe to that it's all about capitalism, because there are a lot of activities that are taught in school that have nothing to do with really making money, or I know people, but life is complicated. I don't think there's one answer to that. But this reading in particular today did grab me, because it was sort of like analogous. The discoveries that the Matsutake pickers were making was, to me, analogous to any inquiry into human activity and exploring and learning. So I think you need exposure to a forest to really understand it. You have to be able to go there from day to day and see changes and see what the difference, the kind of sky you have, like whether it's overcast or sunny, whether it's winter, summer, spring, fall. There's a lot to learn about the world.
But Maria, to your point about learning experientially about the world, the reason why our schools have all of these subjects is so you can trace that lineage back to the rationality out of the Enlightenment period in Europe, where really they came out saying the brain is the tool with which to understand the world. We can know everything there is to know through the rationality in the brain. And that bias has been the legacy of education. And so the alternate, which you beautifully described as experiential, understanding the world by behaving in it, by really interacting with the environment, that's denigrated as not an education, really. That is viewed as place-based, traditional, and the kind of, quote, knowledge that's viewed as important is what they would call universal concepts. Through mental concepts, you understand principles about the world, and that really doesn't address what we have many times touched in our topics here, which is this complex, spontaneous, differentiated, real world that's always variable.
Yeah, I get it. But it really, don't you think it depends on the educator?
I think the educator's caught in our system.
Yeah. I mean,
Depends
that's
on the educator and the student, in my experience, when
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
taught. And a lot of people aren't, there are students who just aren't interested. That does happen, you know, in the same way that they don't know what the name of the tree is on their street. There's a tremendous amount of people who don't know east, west, north, south. Okay.
Right. That never ceases to amaze me.
And
They give you
There's good reason for that. There's really good reason for that. It's not just an individual proclivity to knowing spatial orientation. It's a bias in the whole system against those kinds of against that kind of knowledge. I mean, you wouldn't find an indigenous person who wouldn't know their way to navigate through the world. It's part of their understanding of how to live. And that's downplayed, I think, in a system that prioritizes sort of mental and technology.
it can also be the difference between city and country. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
I grew up.
I'm
in the
always
country,
amazed when
rural
people.
area, so
Have you ever?
people Mhm. Go ahead. I'm finished.
Well, I didn't hear what you said, Marianne.
I said it's indigenous, but it's also can be, you know, have you been raised in a city? Have you been raised in the countryside? Have you been raised on land? Have you been raised on a farm? Have you been raised in an apartment? You know, there are a lot of, it's a vast world. It's a vast country with so many different ways to live in it. Just speaking about this one, the United States.
I think what's interesting to me about, you know, knowing where north, south, east, and west is it has to, I think it's somewhat has to do with age. The younger people seem not to get it. So that tells me that, you know, they probably didn't get it from their parents or from the way, like they didn't take car trips with their parents maybe, or read maps. I mean, when I was young, we grew up with maps. I mean, that's it. You know, you find the point and you figure out the best way to go. You know, now we have the technology has taken over, and you listen to your GPS. And sometimes, have you ever called an office and asked for directions? And the person says to you, okay, so you get on this street and then you make a right and then you make a left, and you go like, wait a minute. When you come to that street, what direction are you coming to it from that you make the right? You know, it's like no sense of place, no sense of context.
Automated GPSs have really, you know, stymied some mental faculties.
I know. And then also at calculators. I mean, we always did math longhand. And I mean, addition, subtraction, division, multiplication.
I'm not complaining about the invention of GPS and calculus.
Yeah, I think everything has its, you know, it's how
Also,
we
kids didn't
that
invent them.
matters, isn't it? It's what use we make of it.
No, we didn't invent them. You all, you know, the adults pushed it on us. So,
Can I show you my bee?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That
It is looking like a bee.
Okay, good. It needs a little bit more dark thread to finish the back leg over there. And for some reason, I've run out of dark thread. So I have to get some, and I have to figure out where to get it.
Go to Michael's or Joanne's.
Oh yeah.
I can send you
have to
some.
find where one is.
I can send you some. Just, do you have the number of what the colors were?
No. No. But it's like a navy blue. But don't worry about it, because I'll go find some and just finish it up and send it back.
Okay.
To you.
Are you doing a special stitch on that? That looks like an advanced stitch.
A mess a mass stitch called pastiche.
Mine is coming along slowly. I'm really backlit, so you can't tell. But maybe I can.
What's that? Oh, is that one of the microscope?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ooh, lovely.
That's a nematode that you're filling out.
There's another nematode.
A nematode.
Lovely. You're having fun with the colors.
I am having a lot of fun with the colors.
That looks like a Rastafarian nematode.
Yeah, the colors are awesome.
Thanks.
Well, I think I'm done for the night, guys. It's been really nice tonight.
It was great having you here.
Yeah, I haven't been here in a while. It's nice. Thanks. Have a good week.
You too. On that note, I'm actually just gonna, because it's getting a little late, I'm gonna give us our weekly end of the session question to reflect on. So if everybody's okay with that, I know that's kind of abrupt. All right, well, I will read it and then we will enjoy our weekends. What are the dances and lifelines you sink into when foraging, hiking, or in the wilderness? And the other one is, what are the places that are intertwined with memories of others, like an old friend's Matsutake spot? And with that,
First one again, please.
sure. What are the dances and lifelines that you sink into when foraging, hiking, or in the wilderness? And then I'll just read the other one just for good measure. What are the places that are intertwined with memories of others, like an old friend's Matsutake spot? And with that, oh, Michelle.
Yeah, next time when Jen, you send the next session, could you put those questions in the?
We could. Well, there's no pressure to answer them. These are more
No,
like.
but it's nice to have little.
Sure.
You deal with something and you come with something already in mind.
Sure. That's a good idea.
It's nice for continuity.
Yeah.
We doing the same reading, I mean, the same book next week?
Yes, next week is the last week of this series, so we will finish the book essentially. We might skip a chapter, but we're gonna read a chapter and then read the last chapter. So with that, everybody, thanks for coming and have a lovely weekend.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.